Hey, listeners, we're so glad you're here with us today. We have an exciting episode for you. Elizabeth and I were in Crested Butte, Colorado this past weekend at the Mountain Words Festival. It was an amazing gathering of writers and readers and lots of discussions around books and the writing process. And we just thought that you'd all be really interested in hearing what little tidbits and nuggets of wisdom we gleaned from the different authors and speakers we heard, and sort of learning across the genres and how that can apply to any of us in any genre. So I'm going to kick it over to Elizabeth here. She was there at the very beginning, so she's going to share some from that, and then we're going to just sort of ping pong back and forth with some of our insights that we glean. So here we go.
Yeah, and listener, you should know I took 22 pages of notes, so we are just hitting the highlights. The real value is in putting yourself in these rooms. So we are going to do our best to kind of share these little nuggets of wisdom that we think could apply more universally, but only you will know what really resonates. And when you put yourself in these spaces to actually learn from these people and gain the inspiration, it's so valuable. And just a special shout out to the Mountain Words Festival, and that so much of this content was free content. You didn't even have to pay $1 to attend, I think, almost 20 events throughout the course of the long weekend. And as Stephanie's talked about before, there are other ways to gain either reduced price access or free access to these sort of conferences, like being a volunteer. I was awarded a need-based scholarship to attend this one. So just know that a lot of these are accessible no matter what your financial situation is. And there are ways to get yourself into these spaces. And I just encourage you to do that. So we'll jump in and provide some nuggets of wisdom, but always those connections in person and those experiences are just so much more invaluable than we could ever emphasize. One of the first workshops I attended was called A Play in 2 Hours. And this was led by Stephen Cole Hughes, who is a theater teacher at Western University. And what I really took from this one is he emphasized that words are action. And he talked about the value of the words, and he talked a little bit about history and how in the 1870s to 1890s, there was this big transition from a pure plot-focused narrative to the inner motivations and relationships of the individuals appearing. So if you think back to the old films of there's a train barreling down the tracks and someone's been tied to the train tracks, and will the villains get away with the money? It is purely just plot-based, right? We're not getting into the inner worlds or thoughts or feelings of any of those characters. But it was around this time that it really shifted, the narrative shifted. And he used this phrase that I want to share, that it went from the drama of life to the drama in life. So it went from a focus of the external events that were occurring to the internal motivations, feelings, and experiences of the characters. There was also this beautiful quote he shared from Aristotle, and I'm just going to paraphrase what I have written in my note. But in reference to story having a beginning, middle, and end, Aristotle wrote that poets, or a term for writers back in the day, tie knots really well, but don't know how to unravel them. So that's to say, it's very easy, to have a strong beginning, even a moving middle, but so much of the time, the challenge is in the unraveling, the end. How are you going to finish out the story? So he led us through an experience of picking a sort of brainstormed noun and a brainstormed verb and writing for 10 minutes, essentially a scene between two characters. And those two characters were not allowed to perform any actions. There were no stage directions or anyone new entering the scene or these characters leaving the scene. And all of the action, all of the conflict had to be expressed through these two characters' conversations. And this was definitely a challenge, but I think a very good one, and one that Stephanie and I are going to turn into a free workshop and run people through this, because it really challenged me to think outside of my normal repertoire of action things and really focus on the dialogue, which as a memoir writer, I'm really, not comfortable with and I don't use very often. And I found this to be very challenging and helpful to develop this conflict between these two characters and then ultimately curate how one is going to win and one is going to lose. They're both going to win, they're both going to lose. And ultimately creating a very short scene where there's a beginning, middle, and end, and a theme, a premise of what are they seeking? What is the truth that's being expressed through this scene? So that is something that we will include in a future workshop. The next workshop is one that Stephanie and I attended together, and it was using a lens to tell a story, which was put on by Manuel Aragon, and he is a photographer and a videographer and a filmmaker in practice, and he was equating the things that he does to curate a story through photography and film to inform the writer on how to establish that same sort of focus or lens in story writing. So Stephanie, would you like to talk about some of your takeaways from that workshop?
Yeah. So one of the things that I really appreciated about his workshop was truly giving a different lens through which to view the writing process. And I mean, we're certainly doing video here as we, record our podcast. And, we certainly have done some of our own with things we put on social media. But he was really talking about how you look at the world and using that as a framework for structuring the writing process. And one of the things I loved was how he talked about the use of color. And I hadn't really thought about the value of color in my own writing, but as he shared these very vibrant pictures of a Cinco de Mayo festival and Day of the Dead and other aspects of the Latin culture, or as he called it, the Latinx culture that he's a part of. And he really uses that to tell stories. And it was really interesting to then apply it to my own writing and thinking about, well, how can I think about color? And I found myself then looking at things in different ways. And he talks about color theory, and he talked about using the language of color. What role can color play in a scene? And so, he showed a picture, but then he also put out the challenge of think about whatever you're working on yourself. And so it took me a moment, and I'm, basing my story in a ski town. And so I was thinking very much about, well, how can color on, say, a Bluebird ski day play into what's noticed? Or how, when it's a, stormy day on the mountain, how that changes the color and the tone of, how people look on the mountain, the outfits they're wearing, and all of those components. And he also talked about thinking about what the camera can capture that can appear in your own writing. And he talked about this in the context of creating a lookbook. And, lots of writers at this conference talked about using Scrivener, and I use Scrivener. And one of the things I love about Scrivener is that you can put images in. And as I've created my characters, I've pulled images of, celebrities from, the internet, and I've just dropped them into that part of my story planning. And it helps me look back and think, okay, this is how I'm imagining this person is. But what I hadn't thought about was, hey, start putting in pictures of scenes and, places and, what are they eating or what are they doing or where are they? And I thought, well, here I was sitting here thinking like, oh, I have to do this all from my memory or things that I remember myself or, all of those pieces. But then I was thinking, wow, this is really cool. And he talked about creating a lookbook that, just sort of back to the basics of like a 3-ring binder idea of just, what do you want the progression of your story to look like, and think about it in pictures. So yeah, that was a big part. I think those were the biggest takeaways that workshop. How about you, Elizabeth? What were some of the things that you took away from his talk?
I had the same. The only thing I would add is that Stephanie and I want to do, again, a future Zoom workshop where we all get together with our stories and pull these images that she's referring to. For me, with memoir, some of those will be like actual images that I took on various, hiking trips or at certain things like a birthday party or New Year's Eve celebration or whatever it was that I'm writing about. I'm sure, Stephanie, you'll have pictures of like the coffee shop and how it's decorated, trying to figure out how you're gonna, express that in your writing. And so that'll be another thing that we put out. And I'm referencing all these future workshops and stuff. If you hop on our email list, that's how you can always stay up to date on those offerings. We don't always have time to put out a podcast episode in conjunction where we announce it here. So the email list is the way to stay most up to date on that. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, please join our email list and subscribe. The next thing that we both attended was a panel of 2 published authors, and they talked a lot about the entrepreneurial writing journey. And the biggest takeaways I got from their discussion was talking about, the fears that come with writing, that fear of stretching and putting yourself out there in new spaces, the extreme value of the accountability and encouragement to take risks in creatively productive ways that came from having a small group. There was 3 of them that worked together routinely, met weekly. They set weekly goals, which reminded me so much of our time to write session, Stephanie, and how we set a goal for our writing at the beginning of that session. And then they also did some long-term planning and setting those sort of long-range reach goals of wouldn't it be amazing if? And they reflected tearfully, like there was so much emotion as they were sharing that ultimately all 3 of them had done and accomplished these things that they had put in the back of the notebook of one day it would be great if. And these were like big reach things like becoming a New York Times bestseller or publishing, being published in National Geographic or some other like really big name magazine or anything like that, winning certain awards. And it, to me, just spoke to the fact that we as writers have to show up consistently and that so much of our work will go unrecognized, will go unpublished, will get rejected. There's so much hidden work underneath the works that really make our career. And that was something that not only did I hear in this session, but I heard reflected in numerous other conversations with other writers and panels. And then another key piece I got from this is about the feedback, is about how they dealt with the rejections and how ultimately when some, complete works like novels were rejected, they now in hindsight can see that it just really wasn't good writing. It wasn't a good story. In some cases, it wasn't necessarily fixable, but they really valued that rejection and that feedback. Also, when they talked about feedback in regards to like beta readers and stuff, they recommended posing questions that I thought were really insightful with things like, how did this part make you feel? And understand and trying to determine whether the reader was feeling that same sense that the writer had the objective to make them feel. And that was a really interesting because it helped create a filter or a framework for how you accept or exclude certain feedback. Because ultimately, someone may have done something differently or they may, give feedback about, oh, I would do this differently. But at the essence, it's, did I portray this feeling that I wanted you to portray, that I was hoping to portray? Or what were you thinking during this particular part? Maybe I wanted you to be confused during this part, and so if you were confused, great. That's positive feedback because I wanted you to be confused. And it's just ultimately knowing whether your work is translating the way that you intended. Is the reader getting out of it what you had hoped? Did you have any other inputs from that panel, Stephanie?
Well, yeah, I mean, a lot of the same of what you just shared. And I especially love the aspect of the little red book that they had that where they wrote their goals and then their reach goals. Wouldn't it be amazing if? And I think that sometimes, we get so buried in our day to day, we forget to stop and take a moment and reflect. But like you said, it speaks so much to the value of a community. And that's why we've created the community we have online. We have our Time to Write session, small, supportive group that, for writing and just finding those people who support and nurture your goals, because that's how you reach them. And I mean, these two authors were certainly, proof of that they had found each other and through that support and encouragement. And as they said, like they started out kind of knowing each other and then they really knew each other. And so then it was the like, oh my goodness, I don't know if I want to show up next week and have to say I didn't follow through on what I had done. And so that was a big piece of that. I think, there were a couple of quotes that I noted down of, the idea that the whole journey of finding your way as a writer is a bit like an unsupported spacewalk. Like, so if you're just out there in space and you're not tethered to the space station, like you don't know where, I mean, you hope that you're not going to go that far from the space station, but you don't know, and you don't know which direction you're going to go. And you hope your spacesuit is going to work in the same way that with writing, you hope what you're trying to do is going to work. And sometimes you just don't know how it's going to go. And then they talk too about the whole idea of the sort of iceberg theory that you see where, oftentimes what we see out in the world, especially on social media, is really only the tip of the iceberg, what everybody's accomplished. And it often can feel like it just happened overnight and that you're not sure that you're going to be able to accomplish that. But really underneath is this enormous block of ice that is all the hours and all the pages that have been, ripped to shreds or burned or whatever happens, and just all of the long path to get there. And then just sort of the emphasis on just how it's hard to write a book, and just the idea of, asking a lot of questions along your journey, not being afraid to, show up, even, for events like we went to, where, as Elizabeth said, the majority, so many of the sessions were free. And these were with, authors who have, been National Book Award winners, or they're been, on the list for a National Book Award or Pulitzer Prize and all of these things. So, it was really amazing to be able to sit there with them. And then they talked too about, there are a lot of failed novels. Not every novel and not every one of their pieces of writing ended up out in the world. And they talked about this cycle of, try, fail, learn, try, fail, learn. And they were, which I thought was a really great piece, because I think sometimes when we try something and we fail, that's where people stop. They think like, oh, I tried it. It didn't work. So I'm not going to keep going. And what they were saying is you try, you fail. Okay, what was the lesson? What did you learn from that? Okay, so I'm going to try again and I'm going to do something different. And with that, they talked about how when it did come time to, sending a manuscript in, that oftentimes the gatekeepers were actually giving them a gift when they rejected their work, that truly it wasn't the right book to be out in the world. And so, that's something to, sure, it's uncomfortable. We don't want, this is something we love. It's our, sweat and tears, all of that. But truly they said that at the end of the day, it made what they did next that much better. So I just thought that it was just very, sort of grounding to sit there and feel like, you know, we can be in their seat one day, because if we just keep taking steps forward, anything really is possible. And that was sort of an overarching message from the whole experience of the weekend that I walked away with, is like, yes, I can keep showing up for myself. I can keep doing that.
Yeah, in a sense, I also felt like it just took the pressure off of like making my current project the big thing, you know? I don't know if it's going to be the big thing or not, and I certainly want to do it well, and that's why I've resisted any sort of pressure to put a particular timeline on its completion. Like, it's going to be done when it's done. And, to kind of mirror, because I heard some other authors later talk about this, all that work that goes on behind the scenes before the big break. We got to hear from Shelley Reed, and she spoke about the fact that it took her 13 years to write her first novel and how hard novels are. And I just had no appreciation before this weekend for how hard it is to write a story of novel length, and how so many of these writers started with short stories and magazine articles and poems and much more short form works. And so for us to be kind of diving into this writing world with full length novels is just something to really be commended. And Shelley also said the best way to learn to write a novel is to write a novel. Like, nothing about writing short stories ahead of that really informed her structure around how to write a novel, because it's just a completely different beast. And she talked openly about how it was like 13 years of writing, and then she found an agent, and then it was 2 years of rejections and trying to find publishers. But in the uniformity of some of those rejections, she understood a major tweak she needed to make before ultimately landing with her last, and the publisher she's with now. And now she's an international bestseller, and she's, it's being translated into 34 languages, and she's got a film option on it, and she's a debut author. It's wild. It's wild to hear these stories, but to also have that lens, that kind of mask removed from it, to get to peer behind the curtain and see just how much work goes into it before anyone makes it to this point.
Well, and thinking about, her talk, I just really appreciated how she talked about, I mean, she was just so real about, I didn't really know what I was doing. I know nothing, I have no control, were some of the things, she talked about in the process. And I really appreciated that she just reiterated that each of us is a unique individual with our own stories that no one else has, our own experiences that no one else has that are the same. And that if you just keep showing up for yourself, that you can get it done. And she was very honest about not having a particular structure or plan when she was writing, that it was very much like, oh, this scene came to me, so I'm going to write this scene. Oh, this came to me, I'm going to do this. Then she talked about, playing around with having 3 main characters, and then that shifted and changed to having one very strong main character and then a secondary character as time went on. And, she talked about, her big word for the day was authenticity, that if you show up as your true authentic self, that you have a story to share. And, and one of the questions she posed was, what matters? And, and so if you sit with that for a minute and you think, what matters? What matters to me and why? And I encourage you to, listener, to take a minute, and whether right now or later, to journal about that and, think about what matters to you, especially as a writer. And she was also another one that talked about, what can I learn here when, going through the process. And I also really appreciated, in terms of sort of the publishing world process, that she talked about how a good editor never makes you do anything. That if you have a good editor, that is someone who will come to you and ask you questions and ask for clarification. And it's an approach that puts it back to you as the writer to then think, is that working the way I want it to work? Is that the message that I meant to send to my reader? Is that what I meant to do? And she said, sometimes you make the changes, sometimes you don't. But I really, appreciated that insight, because I think so often, as writers, you want to think like, oh, somebody really liked me and they've accepted me and okay. And then you feel like you have to do everything to please that person. And I really appreciated that she brought it back to that it's your work at the end of the day, but you should be working with the people who are not going to make you do anything to your work to, take it away from what's truly authentic.
That was the same thing mirrored in last week's guest episode with Lena Abarathi. She talks about that. And the other piece I want to add about what Shelley said about her editor was not just that they would ask questions, but they would also point out the weak spots. And they would say, this scene or this character is weaker than your other ones. But they wouldn't tell her how to fix it or even that she had to fix it. They would simply just note the weaknesses. And I think that's the key piece she was trying to emphasize, is that a good editor is not going to tell you how to fix something or what specifically to change, but they are going to point out to you, where things are, whether the plot's falling apart or character's not strong or something's not super plausible. And it was really interesting to hear her talk about that experience. Another thing that she shared and a couple of the other authors kind of mirrored in a panel discussion I heard with her was talking about when your book is ready, right? So we can sit and stew over stuff for so long. And I think it was Olivia Chada that's talked about how she really relies on her critique partners and her beta readers in order to tell her when her book is ready, because as an author, it can be so difficult to know when it's time to let it go. And another sentiment was that when you change it, when you're doing, word changes and updates and all these little micro things that you get to nitpicky things towards the end of your editing process, when you're changing it, but the changes aren't making the story any better, then it's come, full form and is ready to get out into the world. But I just thought that reference to the beta readers and critique partners was really stood out to me, because Stephanie and I preach community and the need for community because of having those critique partners and having those beta readers and having those people to bounce ideas off of and mirror things for you. I mean, while so much of writing in the actual writing process is done in a silo, there's so much value in the community and the interactions we have with others. So that was just one more little bit that I wanted to highlight in regards to that.
Yeah, no, I think that it's so important to think about that, because the readers are the people that you are writing for. And they are the people who are going to react and respond to your book. And, Shelley, and along with a lot of the other authors, talked about that, about the ways in which readers engaged with their book and, how it touched them in different ways or brought new insights in different ways. And so I think that that's what's so important about finding people to, be in your corner. And they don't have to be professional writers. They just have to be people who love books, because people who love books know what they want to have happen. They have a sense, especially if they are hardcore readers in certain genres, they know the rhythm of a book. And in thinking about that, one of the interesting things is I was in another session with an author who talked about how, as he goes through his process, he'll write a little bit, iterate, have people read, and go back and sort of do the thing of, going back and forth through the book, of writing to a certain point, seeing if it worked, sharing it, then going back and then writing to the next point and going back and then writing further into the book and going back. And so it really comes down to this idea that every author finds their way through in some way, and not every process is the same. Yes, there are so many great craft books out there, and we certainly focus on crafts in our podcast and in our work from time to time because, it worked for us. It might not work for everybody. And sometimes the craft doesn't work and we veer off and we experiment with some different things, especially when, going to things like this where you're trying out, different writing experiences, like Elizabeth shared at the beginning of this podcast about writing the play where it was all dialogue and there, you can't have any stage direction, and how that was a whole new experience. And really, I mean, one of the things behind this episode is really thinking about, what can we learn from other genres that can help us or stretch us as writers?
The re-outlining of my story and shifted stuff around. Well, I thought that I was doing it quote unquote wrong, right? Like I thought I had maybe missed this step or hurried through this step in the early writing process. But it was really validating for me as a writer to hear that so many of these writers, whether they're writing, scientific nonfiction sort of works or historical nonfiction or even the fiction genres, like so many of them don't land on the actual structure of their story until the editing phase. So I just wanted to, emphasize that one more time for our listeners, because it was something I had judged myself for, but it did make sense when they talked about how it can be difficult to see the framework to best translate the essence of the story and the character arc until you get all the stories down. And only then are you able to separate, the wheat from the chaff, as, Shelley Reed talked about with removing an entire character that is now, in a drawer somewhere. In you really just need to just write these stories, whether you write them, in the order that you think they're going to appear in your book, or whether you jump around for what you feel inspired or motivated to write. Ultimately, the many of the writers that were there highlighted that the structure and the style of the storytelling, later in the revision and editing stage. So this is what we're going to cover for today's episode. But we do still have a little bit more to discuss about world building. But there's so much there, and it's such a big topic. So we're going to save that for another episode. So stay tuned for that. Again, if you want to stay updated on the workshops that we referenced, please subscribe to our email list. If you enjoyed this podcast episode, please send it to a writer friend of yours. And thank you for subscribing and following us.